Welcome to Goodwin Law Unplugged, Florida real estate and more. This podcast features candid insight from real estate industry professionals from all sectors. Your host, attorney Matthew Goodwin, a native Floridian and experienced real estate attorney, will provide his personal insight on legal matters and feature other professionals offering their candid advice. Whether you're a first-time homebuyer, seasoned investor, or experienced real estate agent, there is something for everyone. Thanks for joining us on Goodwin Law Unplugged.
Hi, everybody. This is Matt Goodwin. This is our second episode, and I'm really excited to bring some more content to you. As a reminder from the first episode, this podcast is aimed at educating anyone involved in buying and selling real estate, including real estate professionals, real estate investors, and the public at large. You can always submit questions online at Goodwin Law's website or Facebook page. And remember, the information presented on this podcast is not intended to be legal advice. Listening or asking questions doesn't create an attorney-client relationship. If you have specific legal issues, I encourage you to contact an appropriately licensed professional. Today, I'm going to talk to you about timelines. When you buy and sell real estate, there are several important timelines. One of the most obvious timelines is the closing date. When would you like to close? And often that's one of the most important timelines that becomes significant as to whether you are becoming breach of that contract. Today, I'm going to drive the point home on the importance of timelines in general and not really go too far into the details of specific timelines. But for instance, you have the timeline to make your initial deposit. You have the timeline to have the property inspected. So your due diligence period is often referred to. You have the timeline to apply for and also be approved for a loan. They call that a financing or a loan approval contingency. You have a certain amount of time to terminate the contract, depending on the form of contract. You have an appraisal timeline if you have an appraisal contingency, and oftentimes that's one of the longer ones. You have other timelines that are statutorily determined, such as disclosure of assessments and fees due under your homeowners association, and other disclosures for whether if your property's a condominium. And those are very stringent timelines that you cannot contract out of. The point being is that because there's so many timelines, it's important for you to understand not only what they are, but when they apply. And at the time you enter that contract and it becomes binding, you need to know the specific dates that those timelines occur on. And that's where a real estate attorney can come in, and an experienced real estate professional, either an agent or a broker. And for experienced investors who don't work with real estate agents, it's possible for them to be aware of those timelines. But one of the things that often comes up, even with experienced agents and buyers and sellers, is they want to know when their deadline is to do something. But more often, is that deadline has already arrived and they want to know whether it's too late to do anything else. One of the most often extended deadlines, other than the closing date, of course, is the inspection deadline. There's a lot of things that can create the need and the desire to extend the time period that you have to inspect the property. In Florida, there are a number of inspections that you can get. And there's not a one size fits all. You have your general inspections, you have specific inspections. The specific inspections may be by a licensed roofer, an AC company, a termite professional, or wood destroying organism inspection. You have radon tests, also mold, which mold is found in pretty much every home in Florida because of the humidity levels, especially South Florida. So what you're inspecting for there is toxic levels, elevated levels of toxic mold. So if you end up with a situation where your inspection deadline is approaching, your options always depend on the form of contract that you're using. Because there are so many different forms of contracts that come across my desk, I always go to the contract when I get a question. I may have visited that contract 1,000 times after it's been changed over a course of several years. And I may have confronted the same set of facts multiple times, but I'll still go back to the contract because by not doing so, you're relying on your memory to be absolutely perfect. So the things you want to go back to the contract for are often very fact sensitive. You want to look for the types of defects that you can get out of the contract for, and the types of defects that you have no right to get out of the contract for, such as which may be considered cosmetic, a torn screen, a missing shingle, things like that. But because the form of contract matters, you may be able to get out of a contract for a cosmetic defect. For instance, if you're using what's called an as-is contract. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to accept the property as is and you can't ask for things to be fixed. What it means usually in Florida is that during that inspection period that's predefined, you can get out of the contract for pretty much anything. There may be some exclusions depending on the form you're using, but you don't have to find something that's defective per se in the contract to get out. On the flip side, though, if you're using one of those as-is contracts and you ask the seller to fix something, they're not obligated to fix it either. And that's why the timeline is so important, because once you reach that deadline, if you either haven't finished your inspections or receive the response from the seller that you have asked for, you either need to terminate that contract or extend that inspection period. And if you do neither, then you have accepted the property in its as-is condition. So the inspection deadline is very, very important. Sometimes you rely on third parties and not people that you're hiring, but a government body for your inspection period to be thorough. It may be the permitting office at the county or the code enforcement office at the county. So many factors go into this process. So important part is know what the timelines are at the beginning when you enter the contract. Put them on your calendar, tie a string around your finger if you're getting really close to it, whatever it takes for you to make the right decision. And if you ever feel that you haven't had enough time, ask for an extension or terminate the contract while you can. That's the best advice I can give you when you're presented with that situation. The other really important timeline that we often get questions on is the financing deadline. And this, again, is very particular based on the form of contract you're using. So it's not as simple as saying you have 30 days to apply for a loan, and if you don't get it in 30 days, you can cancel. There's more to it. And oftentimes, by the time the issue is presented to me, it's really complicated, and that easy out period isn't as easy as you thought it was. So the sooner in the process you can get answers to those questions, the better. And then you know how to proceed if you get really close to that deadline. And a lot of the experienced real estate agents that I work with will guide you in that process, but you can't rely on somebody else, no matter how trusted they are, to make a decision for you and also tell you last minute when that decision is too late. Now, does it happen? Absolutely. We want to be involved in the process, either as your real estate attorney, real estate professionals. Some get more involved than others. But you as the buyer or the seller have a duty as well to make sure you know what you're signing, how it can affect you, and how much it could cost you for making a bad choice. Some of the other timelines that I mentioned, disclosures required by law, homeowners associations, and condo disclosures, those are so strict and so short. I'll give you the homeowners association disclosure, for instance. From within 3 days after you receive the required disclosure, you can cancel the contract as the buyer. So the seller has everything to lose by not making that disclosure timely. And that's where the real estate agent can come in. The condo disclosure works similarly, where if the property's in a condo, then you have to provide a certain set of documentation. And within a few days of receipt of that, the party, even if it's right before closing, the buyer has the right to cancel. If you live in Miami-Dade, there is a new disclosure that's required. It's not necessarily a timeline. It's more of you better make this disclosure or the buyer the contract's voidable. And that's if your property's in a special taxing district. There's over 100 special taxing districts in Miami. And luckily, there's an easy website where you can type your address in, see if you're in it, and then you make the disclosure on this form and your job is done. But the time to do all that is at the time when the contract is signed. And what that does is it covers all your bases in the beginning as far as disclosures go. And then you don't have to worry about canceling on a technicality in the future. And that's where the focus becomes on all of these other timelines. The last timeline I'm going to talk to you about today is the closing date. In most, if not all contracts, the closing date is considered where time is of the essence. And I'm not going to go into describing exactly what that is because there are a varying number of opinions on what that means. In a general sense, it means that if you don't close on time, then you can hold the other party accountable and consider them in breach of the contract. If you're the buyer, seller's not ready to close on the closing date, you get your deposit back with a couple of exceptions. And if you're the seller and the buyer can't perform their end by the closing date, then the seller has the right to get out. In most cases, unless the deposit has already been forfeited, in some case, I should say, unless your deposit's already been forfeited, then as the buyer or as the seller canceling for that reason, often the deposit will go back to the buyer. On another podcast, I'll drill down a little bit more detail on some of these where I can give you some stories because, I can sit here and talk to you about all these timelines and how they matter, but you don't always realize how you're going to be affected by a particular timeline until it's too late. That's why it's important to involve a real estate attorney early on in the process. I'm not discounting involving working with an experienced real estate professional. Matter of fact, I encourage you to work with an experienced real estate professional on every transaction as well. The real estate attorney will often come in and answer those questions that the agent or the real estate professional is not permitted to answer. And that's anything having to do with a legal question, interpreting the contract. They can tell you what it says, but unless they're a licensed attorney in Florida, they can't interpret what it means. And a real estate attorney can. So for any of you buying or selling real estate in Florida, especially right now with all the craziness that's going on, just make sure that you're getting good advice. Make sure you're aware of the timelines. Make sure you read the contract before you sign it. Even if you've signed contracts before, look at the fine print, especially look at the bold print. Believe it or not, the most commonly used forms in Florida, there's only a few of them. The most important provisions are bolded. There's also some forms that have an asterisk next to the line numbers where there's important information. So these are the little things, little shortcuts where after you do it a few times, you know what to look for. But there's always going to be a set of facts you're going to have to think through with a trained mind on how to proceed in your circumstances. That's all for today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Goodwin Law Unplugged. To learn more about Goodwin Law and to utilize our services, visit GoodwinEstatelaw.com or call 239-207-3403. Hablamos Espanol. To submit questions or be a guest on a future episode, message us on our website or on social media by searching for Goodwin Law PA in Naples, Florida. This has been Goodwin Law Unplugged. Thanks again for joining us.